Thank you for coming out, yes, in spite of this rain that's apparently coming down in buckets. Welcome to the 32nd Annual Holocaust Lecture Series, and thank you for coming. On your way in, you were given surveys specific to tonight's talk. After the talk, before joining us for a reception across the way, if you'll just take the time to fill those out, your feedback is very helpful for preparing for the next year's series. We also want you to know that next Sunday at 7 p.m., Marty Weiss, a Holocaust survivor, will be speaking at the law school. Tonight's talk is by Professor Ellen Clayton, who is the Rosalind E. Franklin Professor for Genetic and Health Policy. She not only holds appointments to Vanderbilt's law and medical schools, but she also directs the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society. From her work on post-Holocaust theology during her first year at Duke to her medical and law degrees from Harvard and Yale, Professor Clayton has an impressive career in bioethics and health policy. Her research includes law and genetics, as well as the intersection of law, medicine, and public health. Tonight's talk will outline the history of the eugenics movement from its origins in England, its growth in the US, its practice in Nazi Germany, and genetics as they're practiced in the 21st century. The Holocaust Lecture Series would like to thank the Vanderbilt University Medical Center for its support and also the University Commons for use of its facilities. And of course, thank you, Professor Clayton, for your time. Professor Clayton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be asked to do this talk. And I want to say at the outset that I know that there are some students in the audience. I actually am able to stop and field questions at any point along the way. And so if you get confused or something, please don't hesitate to shoot your hand up. And then at the end of the talk, I do mean to leave time for questions. And I am very eager to be in conversation with you. So there's a lot of information that I'm going to be passing along to you, but I really am very eager to hear your thoughts and to hear your responses to what we're talking about. So what is eugenics and where did it come from? My husband and I were talking about this just before I started today because, in fact, eugenics, which really means good breeding, was formulated the idea before we even had a concept of a gene, something that is just almost hard to imagine in 2009. But it was coined by Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and encompassed two different notions. One was the idea of good breeding, of having good traits passed down from generation to generation, as well as bad breeding, and the idea that some bad traits were handed down from family to family, and that you really didn't want to see those. Now, one example, actually fairly interestingly enough, that was actually put out for the notion of positive eugenics was the family tree of the Darwin Galton family. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, if you look at this family tree, first of all, squares are men, circles are female. All the people in black are members of the Royal Academies in England. Now, the argument here was that obviously there was something really good going on in this family to have so many members of the Royal Academies. But of course, more runs in families than just genes. And the language you speak, whether your parents talk to you at home, whether they encourage learning, something which I would suspect everybody in this room probably experienced in their upbringing, all of that contributes to what you see, to say nothing of the fact that this was a society that was highly based on favoritism at the time. So this was held out as an example of, well, obviously this family has great genes or great breeding, but obviously there was a whole lot more than that. From its very earliest days, The eugenics movement, which began in England and, as you've already heard, spread rather famously to the United States, began with an appeal to science. The proponents of eugenics took the view that you could tell who had good genes and bad genes, and you could calculate it, you could identify them, you could calculate their impact. So this is a picture from Nazi Germany, and what you see here at the bottom of the picture are calipers around a skull. And the idea that was embodied here was that you could measure skull shape, side to side, front to back, etc. And if you measured that, you could tell who had a good German head as opposed to a bad non-German head. Here in print that you can't see is a report that was written by Charles Davenport, who was a major proponent of eugenics in the United States, in which he outlines the costs of a particular bad family to society. A topic of enormous discussion during this period were two families called the Jukes and the Kallikaks, and the idea where they embodied bad breeding. And so this is a many-page article that includes a list of the various costs that the Jukes imposed on society, including things like years of imprisonment, costs of maintenance, total men contaminated, charity obtained by begging. I mean, many things that are put here to show that it is obvious that these bad families, these bad genes, even though they didn't use that word at that time, were terribly costly to society. They had other notions of positive eugenics. This is another poster from Germany in the 1930s. I am loosely translating some of what it says here, but they say, this is a family that is passing on good genes to many farms. They have lots of children, and as long as they have lots of children, these farms will be well cared for. And if they don't have lots of children, then if you look to the picture at the right, these are farms that are laying fallow because they didn't have these hardy German farmers to till the soil. In the United States, you can't believe how many pictures like this I can come up with, but there was a tremendous movement in the United States to laud really the families with good genes. They had fitter family contests, and you would look at some of these pictures now and you would just laugh. They also had, this was the most eugenic baby in the Minnesota State Fair in 1928. And so they had lots of things where people were awarded for having good, big, strong families. They, of course, were all middle and upper class white, but that was clearly what was being done here in the United States. We saw, however, a very quick elision from the notion of positive eugenics that we want to encourage good families to breed to the notion of negative eugenics. This is a poster of a Nuremberg law for the protection of blood and German honor. This is a eugenic and health exhibit in Kansas in the 1920s. But what these really are both about are anti-miscegenation laws. And this is actually of enormous current importance, but let me set the frame for you. In the 1920s, many, many states passed laws that prevented or prohibited people of different races from marrying each other. Now, I want to be clear here. It was really people from non-white races marrying whites. That's what it was all about. But these were in the 1920s, and they were passed in many, many states. In 1967, the Supreme Court finally struck down anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. I was in high school. So when you think about it, these policies extended well into, well into the lifetimes of many of us in this room, and well into parts of our century that we thought were actually fairly enlightened. So Loving versus Virginia is the name of that case, and it was handed down by the Supreme Court in 1967. They had had an opportunity to decide a similar case just a few years before, and they passed on it. Now, the reason that that is of some current relevance is that if you were listening to CNN last week, you would have heard that there is a justice of the peace down in southern Louisiana who is refusing to marry mixed-race couples. This is last week, 2009, in the United States. Now, it turns out there's another justice of the peace in that same county who will marry mixed-race couples. The justice of the peace, of course, refused to be interviewed by CNN or anybody else. The word was that he was worried about the kids. But this is an ongoing issue in our country even today. And of course, we have the evolution of negative eugenics. And I want to be clear here what I'm doing. There is a real tendency as we think about eugenics to think of it as just being a Nazi phenomenon. That is wrong. And so what I am doing here very explicitly is to show you what was going on in Germany, showing you what's going on in the United States, and to say that there are some really unsettling parallels here. This is a poster that talks about the burden of disabilities. You can see the Aryan man holding two people who obviously seemed like they were less fit in the eyes of the Nazis. This is a slide from the Cold Spring Harbor Archives, which are an amazing archive of images and history that I would bring to your attention. These are so-called hereditary imbeciles. Again, posters that were being used in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, and there were a lot of these. And of course, we have the issue of eugenics. This didn't show up quite right. On the screen on the left is a poster from Germany that's translated, said, "Who wants children like these?" As you can see, these are children who have various dysmorphisms. Interestingly enough, the eugenic sterilization in Nazi Germany was not carried out against the Jews or against the Gypsies or Roma, who were a major target of some of the later activities of the Nazis, but rather against people who were feeble-minded with schizophrenia and epilepsy. And this didn't load quite right, but I'll just do it anyway. I want to make clear here that in the United States, more than 60,000 people were involuntarily sterilized in the period of the 1920s, 1930s, up through the 1940s and 1950s. This occurred, actually, interestingly enough, primarily in California, although we don't really hear about it very much. But there's a whole new history coming out about involuntarily sterilization of Hispanic people in California during the eugenics period. But the seminal moment in United States history was this decision in Buck versus Bell. And I want to speak a little bit about it for a minute because it's so important. It was a case written by Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was a very famous Supreme Court justice. His father was a very famous Harvard Medical School professor. Both of them were very prominent eugenicists. The allegation was that Carrie Buck was an institution in Virginia, that her mother was an imbecile, and that she had a child who was an imbecile. Now, the reason that she was actually in the institution was because of prostitution. And it turns out, and there was a huge article about this in the New York Times just on Sunday, talking about sterilization of young women in residential homes in Wisconsin during the 1940s and 1950s. But in any event, so the question that was raised in this case was, did actually Carrie Buck get due process before her tubes were tied. And here is what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. This decision has never been overturned. Never been overturned. Now, I want to bring to your attention that Paul Lombardo, who is a professor at Georgia State University, has done some exquisite historical work on this particular case. He has 2 books, one that came out last year, and the bottom line is this. Of course, Carrie Buck wasn't retarded. She was a prostitute. Her mother was not an imbecile. She was a prostitute. Her daughter was doing fine in school until she died at the age of 6, as was common in that age, particularly for people who were institutionalized. And for those of you who are aficionados of the law, I will speak a little bit more about this and say that in 1945, the Supreme Court decided a case called Skinner versus Oklahoma, a case in which the sterilization of a man who had committed 3 minor felonies was struck down. It has some very large language in there about the rights to people to procreate. But the reason that they struck down the law was not because his right to procreate had been infringed, but because the statutory line made no sense. It's the first equal protection case. So this was major law in the United States, and it still stands rather uncomfortably as not overturned. And of course, one thing that distinguishes the Nazi experience from what happened in the United States is the final solution. I mean, we all know this, that in fact millions of Jews and Roma and other people were killed at various concentration camps in Germany and throughout Eastern Europe. And so we know, and that was all based on eugenic thinking and the idea of cleansing the populace of these unfit people. Now, I know there are Holocaust deniers out there. We hear about them all the time. But I would just make clear here that there is still the practice of killing people because of who they are, as we see in Darfur and in many other parts of the world. The idea of people killing other people because they somehow have traits that we don't like is something that is still a part of modern history and was not eradicated at the end of the Holocaust. So modern eugenics has grown up in the shadow of the Holocaust. On the left is a tree again from the Cold Spring Harbor Archives that says eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And it says, like a tree, eugenics draws its material from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. And there are many things down there, including but not exclusively genetics. Now, the history of what happened in Nazi Germany, the history of what happened here, has had a huge shadow over the development of genetics in the United States. It certainly was one of the factors that led to the founding of the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Program of the National Human Genome Project. But here I want to turn to what I think is the basic question of this talk is, have we avoided the evil of eugenics, and can we? And I want to suggest to you that there are at least three different ways that we can look at it that I want to turn to in turn. One is, can we just get rid of it by getting rid of bad science? Another is, can we just avoid eugenic policies? And third is, can we avoid eugenic individual choices? So clearly, one of the issues with the eugenics movement was the science was terrible. Think back to that, that slide of the Darwin Galton family. I mean, it was clear that something was running in that family, but it wasn't just genes. And so what they really conflated there, I think in no small part, because they wanted to, I mean, those who were in that family were on the top of the social heap, and so that's a good way to stay there. But part of the notion was that they were actually conflating heritability, things that run in families, with genetics, which is the things that are in our DNA. And so that was a huge problem with the eugenics movement. So, but here I want to say something that will maybe seem a little bit heretical. Certainly, we are getting the science better now. We have a better idea about what's genetic and what's not. At the same time, I think it is what we are really seeing both as a cultural level, at a cultural level and at a scientific level, is a profound tendency to give undue weight to what is genetic and inadequate weight to thinking about the complexity of the impact of the environment and the society and the way genes interact with each other and the way that our human genes interact with microbial genes. 90% of the DNA in my body, 90%, is from bacteria and viruses. It isn't even human. And it's really important that I have all of that, because if I didn't have all that bacterial DNA, I would really be in terrible trouble. So as we think, and so, the people who are at the cutting edge of the science are really understanding that these questions are enormously complicated. And that when we know the whole genetic sequence, we're going to know something, but there's going to be a whole lot we don't know. On the other hand, we have a fascination with genetics, and because we want more funding to do genetics research, we talk about how important it is, and it is really important, but there's other stuff important too. So it's really important that we're getting the science better, but it's equally important that we have a sufficiently nuanced view about what we're really getting when we're actually thinking about genetics. What about eugenic policies? This is an area where I actually think we have something to be fairly proud of in the United States, and I want to pay some attention to this. And I'm going to give you some legal arguments, and then I'm going to give you some other arguments. One is that the view of disability in this country, and actually in many parts of the developed world, has changed dramatically. And I'll give you a more salient example, but I want to spend a minute talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. You probably don't think about this very much, but it was an act passed in 1990. It was the most radical anti-discrimination law passed since the Civil Rights Movement. And what it said, in broad terms, was that people had the right to engage in wage work, to live where they wanted to go where they wanted to go, so long as they could perform the essential functions of the job with regard to work, and so long as it could be done with reasonable accommodation. It is the reason why there are ramps in the sidewalks. It is the reason why when you cross the street around here, the street crossing signs beep. All of that is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's amazing to me that this law was passed in 1990 and there was no mention of genetics. Zero. Hard to imagine. The Human Genome Project has started the year before. I mean, we'd been doing this for a long time. Over many years, the Supreme Court serially eviscerated the Americans with Disabilities Act. And for instance, Sutton versus United Airlines, the case was whether a pilot who wore glasses, many of us are cyborgs, I'm certainly one, couldn't fly airplanes. I mean, even if they could be completely corrected. Other cases of that nature. And it was really getting pretty complicated about whether, and the Equal Employment Opportunity tried to pass regulations that really dealt with the issues of genetics, that tried to suggest that if you had a genetic predisposition, you were covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was pretty clear, both by actions at the Supreme Court and actions under the EEOC, that this was being eviscerated. The good news is that last year, Congress stepped in and actually reversed all this bad law and said, you know, we really meant that we want this to be a society in which people, the lives of people with disabilities are valued. I mean, it's amazing. So I just want to turn to that. So let me talk about changing views of Down syndrome, because I think this is one that really brings it home. When I was a young child, when a child was born with Down syndrome, they were institutionalized. There were cases that talked about whether it was okay for parents not to choose to correct heart defects in children with Down syndrome. The Baby Doe regulations, which were done in the 1970s, were triggered by a case in which a baby with Down syndrome had what's called esophageal atresia. That means that your esophagus, which goes down to your stomach, just didn't connect. So if your food can't get down to your stomach, things aren't going to work. And so the baby died. And so that led to a whole big response. And the thing that I would want to say about that is that the decision not to repair a heart defect in a child with Down syndrome, or the decision not to repair esophageal atresia, is just unthinkable in 2009. It just, we aren't there. And so, so Chris Burke, who is on the left, is a young man with Down syndrome who actually is a TV star. Much has been made of him, but I just would mention him. And then, of course, not very far from here, we have the Kennedy Center, which has done enormous work in sort of thinking about how to mainstream kids with Down syndrome. They now have a sort of a modified college program for some kids with Down syndrome. The point that I want to make here is that in 50 years, the way we have dealt with children with Down syndrome has turned on its head. It's amazing. And it parallels, you know, both what Congress has done and just our whole changing norms of medical ethics. It's a really amazing change. And it does say something about whether what's going on with eugenics. Now, I think we're in an interesting time now, particularly with healthcare reform, so I'm going to go off on a little riff about this, just brief, which is that increasingly we have things like wellness programs that are part of our work life here. All of us who are faculty at Vanderbilt, faculty and staff at Vanderbilt are incentivized rather strongly to get involved in a wellness program. And they really, they want to know if you're too fat or whatever. And what's interesting about that is that those notions are in tension with what's going on with the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act and with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The new regulations for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed last year, those regulations came out less than a month ago. And one of the things that it says is that for wellness programs like Vanderbilt has, they can't collect family history. Well, the very best indicator of genetics at present, and when you're working with a patient, is family history. It's better than all the fancy DNA-based tests, anything. But wellness programs can't collect that information. I called Mary Yarborough up. I said, Mary, are you collecting that on your stuff? And she looked and said, yeah. I said, well, effective January 1, you can't collect that anymore. I mean, it's an easy fix. They can't collect it. But, so there's a real interesting issue here. We want to encourage people to be healthier, but we're worried about how we're going to use the information that's going to help us decide who's at risk and who's not. So I just want to, and by the way, it says eugenics and euphenics. Euphenics means how you are. Your phenotype is how you are. Your genotype is how your genes are. So my phenotype is short, short, blonde, well, artificially blonde, whatever it is. So that's my phenotype. My genes are all the same. One of the big concerns that's at stake today are about eugenic individual choices. One of the major allegations that's made at present is that, well, we don't have to have state policies that require eugenics because, after all, we will all make choices that get there anyway. Here, it's an enormous issue that sort of one of the first real uses of genetics in any kind of clinical care was for reproductive genetic testing. It turns out that, for instance, in Down syndrome, it was understood that it was caused by an extra chromosome in the 1960s. Prenatal diagnosis became possible in the 1970s. I wrote my first article about prenatal diagnosis in 1978. I mean, it was early times. And so the issue was, well, we don't have to have policies that make people engage in negative eugenics because they'll just do it on their own. And in fact, there's an assertion that the number of births of children with Down syndrome is about 50% of expected. And there are also concerns about avoiding what they call invasive testing. And so the concern would be that if you use things like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, this is where you do in vitro fertilization. You put, egg and sperm together, you grow them up to a few cells, and you test one of them and you see if the baby has an extra chromosome or not. And if the baby does, or if the embryo does, then you don't use that one. Use another one that has a normal set. And then the real big one that's coming down the road is detecting fetal cells in pregnant women's blood. It turns out that when you're pregnant, that you're a chimera, mixture of organisms, chimera. And it turns out that, one of the reasons pregnant women are at risk from H1N1 is that you have to have decreased immunity to be pregnant. Because if you had full immunity, you would reject the baby. That's a problem. Also, some of the baby cells get in your blood. And so they've been struggling now for 20 or 30 years to figure out how to get those baby cells out of, quote, a simple blood draw, okay, so they can then test them. And that somehow, current mechanisms often do this kind of testing where you actually have to put a needle into the uterus, and that's more involved. So the concern here is that, well, as this capacity gets more and more available, then people are going to do this more and more. Well, I have two responses to that. Why'd that happen? Okay, never mind. I have two responses to that. One is that although maybe some births are being averted, not all are. And actually, a lot aren't. Remember back to those slides I showed you just a few minutes ago about Down syndrome and what's going on at the Kennedy Center and the kind of work that they're doing with these families. So the idea here that somehow the possibility that people can make reproductive genetic testing choices is somehow going to devalue the life of the children we have here is not what we are experiencing. So I think that's important. Another thing is that of course we can't detect all the children who have various genetic anomalies, but I think there are two other things that are really important here. A lot of women don't want to make these decisions. A lot of women, even when they get a diagnosis, say, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with having a child with Down syndrome. I'm a general pediatrician. I remember mothers who made those decisions during the course of my life. And the interesting thing also, and this goes to, I think, an enormous issue that we could talk about on another level, is that an enormous number of clinicians actually refuse to offer this kind of testing, refuse to care for women who would consider this kind of testing. We are seeing a real culture war about what physicians think are appropriately at stake. So although I think there is so you can say that some people are choosing to terminate pregnancies of fetuses that are going to be born with serious defects, I don't think you're going to see a wholesale devaluing of life with children with disabilities. You walk over to the Children's Hospital and you will see that is not what's going on over there. And there's no sign that that's not going to continue going on over there. Now, I have to say something about enhancement, because after all, I've been talking about negative eugenics so far and what's going on. And I just want to put enhancement in some kind of context. How many of you had parents who read to you when you were little? How many of you had parents who cared what you did about your homework? How many of you had parents who, whatever your extracurricular activity was, whether it was soccer or track or, whatever, how many of you had parents who encouraged you to do that and drove you all over God's green earth, getting you there? How many of you? That's all enhancement, okay? The job of adults, it's a job of, the job of adults is to do that for their children. And the job of the society is to do it for its children. That's what we're supposed to be doing. So another question is genetic engineering, and what I mean by that is gene transfer, where you put a gene in to sort of fix something that's broken. Can we do that? Well, at least for something, I was going to say no. I just read a report 2 days ago about a particular kind of rare eye defect that they can now begin to do some kind of gene therapy for. But the idea that we're going to be able wholesale to go in and fix various disorders is just not what's going to be happening anytime in the near future. Perhaps yes. I think all of us can think about Gattaca, where they do all the stuff to, fix all of his traits. But that turns out to be complicated. And what are the concerns about enhancement? And I have how in parentheses, because I think the real question is, do they really differ in ways from other kinds of enhancement? Are we objectifying children? As a mother of sons, I want my children to succeed. And I want them to be successful and happy, not only for their own sake, but because it says something about, what I've been doing with my life. That's objectification, I guess. I'm not sure how bad that is. The concerns about disadvantaging the unenhanced. I think that this, you talk about, some of the incredible athletes that we see. Are those of us who are slow and can't jump? That's me. Are we disadvantaged by having those characteristics? I don't really think so. And if the solution is the concern about the unenhanced, then the question is really going to be to address that issue, which raises the issue of unequal access, which I think is a real one. And I think the most vexed one is the risk to future generations, particularly if we make genetic changes that are going to be permanent and can be passed from one generation to the next. But I would suggest to you that except for the risk to future generations, every one of those other ones applies to every other kind of enhancement that we talk about. So I think that as we talk about enhancement, we need to talk about what's possible. We need to talk about it in context, and then we have to figure out what we're going to do. So I have a few closing thoughts here. I think the central issue with eugenics, and more particularly genomics, is not the science, but how we use it. Now, we don't always do a good job of using science well, but that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think that the bottom line for us is that we have to be vigilant, that we have to be mindful of making sure that we use our advances of science, which are quite remarkable, in ways that actually benefit people rather than harm them. That is no small task. And it's certainly harder than the science, to tell you the truth. But I think that is the task that is before us if we are really to avoid the evils of eugenics in the age of genomics. But I, for one, particularly giving some of the examples that I've used with regard to changing views of disability, am hopeful that we actually have a possibility of avoiding some of the bad effects that we saw during the eugenics era, both in the United States and in Nazi Germany in the first half of the 20th century. Thank you very much. Now, okay, now questions, comments? Yes.
I want to preface the question with imagine the family tree, the Darwin family tree chart, packed full of Ted Bundys and Bernie Madoffs, okay? And serial killers, I mean, just like really people that have a massively negative impact on the society. Do you believe there are any traits, any empirically measurable traits of a human being that can be used to establish value, you know, aside from genetics, of that individual? Yeah, any type of trait at all that could be used to exclude an individual from, you know, what the society considers valuable.
Okay, oh yeah. So the question is, do I think there are any, suppose I imagined a family tree that was full of Bernie Madoffs and a variety of, and other bad people. And can I imagine a genetic trait that would, any trait, empirically measurable trait? Well, I think that's what the criminal law is about, okay? And let me tell you how the criminal law deals with this, because there are two fairly interesting stories about this that I'd like to tell you. So the issue in criminal law is the idea that you have to be responsible at some level before you can be punished for a crime. Now, one thing about the criminal law is that we are unable to tolerate that at the limit. So let me give you some examples. We are unable to tolerate that in the case of insanity, although that becomes a very vexed notion. We are unable to tolerate that in the context of youth, and I mean little kids. That's getting, you know, more compressible over time. But suppose you had a 6-year-old who, you know, found a gun and shot his mother. I mean, you wouldn't hold that child criminally responsible, okay? So one of the things that we've seen over the years is efforts to use so-called genetic defenses to criminal responsibility. And we had 2 waves of this. One is in the 1970s. It was thought that if you had an extra Y chromosome, girls are XX, boys are XY, and there were some boys who had XYY, and they were thought to be super males. And the idea was that these were born to be bad. And so some criminal defendants tried to introduce that kind of evidence at trial. Now here's a case of bad science coming out. They did those they found these XY males in prison, and they said, well, this is obviously associated with badness. Well, it actually turns out there are lots of XYY males around in general. And so if you did the whole population, you would find that they were just wandering around. So that didn't work very well. But the latest notion is this notion of monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And I'll tell you, there are people here who are currently doing this kind of defense work for criminal defendants. So here's the data about that. And it actually was done by a colleague of Camilla Bembo's at Peabody. So, but the story is this. There is a family in the Netherlands who has a bunch of bad people in it, you know, rapists, killers, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that they have really low levels of this particular enzyme. And so the idea is that they can't control their behavior, okay? And so then there was another study that was done by Caspi et al., in which they looked at a huge number of kids, and they found that if you had kids who had this low level of MAOA and who'd also been severely abused as children, that they tended to be bad people. They tended to have more criminal, more criminal problems. They had character disorders, etc. So, so the argument has been made that if you have low MAOA, it's a bad, and if you've been abused, then you're less responsible. Well, I have a couple of responses, first of all, to the Caspi study, which is, so what are you going to do about this? Are you going to try to identify kids with low MAOA and try to keep them out of abusive households? I mean, that would be nice, but the better idea is to say no kids ought to be in abusive households, because abuse leads to bad behavior anyway. And the interesting thing about it is that if you say low MAOA means that you're really predisposed to be a bad person, then from a criminal law perspective, you have two choices. You can either say, okay, they're not responsible, so they can go free, or the other thing is to say, well, they're dangerous, so we don't want them to go free. And so they really have, I mean, a lot of scholars are writing about this. A lot of cases are being tried around this. But the issue is that if you're going to say that my genes made me do it, I have a bunch of silly slides about that, but, if my genes made me do it, then, what are you going to do? Does that mean that you really can't be in society, and what is society going to do with you? I don't think we have anything that rises to that level, but that is a dangerous defense to raise to bad behavior, because it really means that you probably need to be put away for the rest of your life. That was a longer answer than you wanted, but it's such a complex question, and I just wanted to spin out for you why it's so complicated.
I think the deeper notion is how far do you think enhancement can go? Because I've heard this for years, about, everyone, from like social services, type-oriented people that, no one is beyond salvation. No one is beyond, that everybody had a bad family or whatever, a bad family experience. And I think there are limits to how far enhancement can go, in retrieving a person.
So you're talking about there may be limits on how far you can go. I mean, for instance, a child with Down syndrome, you can do a lot of work with them, but they're not, they're not going to be you, okay? But I think no one thinks that we have given it nearly enough of a try to help people who are less advantaged. And so I would say that until we've done that experiment and until we have the society that actually does that, I'm not willing to say that there's anybody who is beyond hope. Now, admittedly, there are some people who are so severely impaired that what they need is care. And, everybody needs care, but they need care and are unable to make contributions in the same way. But I would say that then we have the responsibility to provide that care. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment going back to eugenics in the Nazi period. You paralleled it with what was going on in America. There was an added populations that fell under the laws of the Nazis, including the deaf population.
Thank you for making that observation. You said that one other group that fell under the, well, many people. So let me repeat what you said, which is that in Nazi Germany, one group who also fell under the Nazi penalties were the deaf. And it's true that there were many, and of course, much of deafness isn't genetic or anything, but or isn't primarily caused by a genetic variation. But it's also, and I think that, and I'm thankful that you brought that up and made the point that these were people who were functioning in society, but they were nonetheless found not to be worth living. It is also true that the web of people who were caught particularly under the involuntary sterilization and others, were very broad, I think, both in the United States and especially in Nazi Germany with the extermination. And don't fall in categories that any of us and some of them don't fall in categories that any of us think make them have lives not worth living in 2009. But I am very grateful for you for bringing up that point about the deaf, because that was an oversight on my part. Yes, sir.
Quick talk, thank you. When you say bad science, do you just mean science that hasn't stood up to extensive peer review?
So the question was, what did I mean by bad science? What I meant by bad science is conclusions of scientific causation that don't stand up. And so, so ideas of imbecility or of prostitution running in families, and that was somehow a result of bad breeding in some genetic sense, is just something that doesn't make sense. And so that's what I meant by bad science.
So good science would be, it stands up over a period of time.
So the question is, would I define good science as that stands up to peer review? Yes, I mean, that's the scientific method. So now the question I think that you're driving at, are there some scientific experiments that we ought not to be doing? And obviously that's a point of enormous debate and ongoing debate, throughout this country. I mean, stem cell research is sort of the exemplar of that in the last decade. And so we can talk about whether there are certain kinds of experiments that ought not to be done. But I would say from a perspective of ethics, one thing we can clearly say is doing, quote, science that isn't going to lead to results is clearly unethical. I mean, that, if you're going to do something to a human being, even with their permission, if you do it in a way that's not likely to lead to generalizable knowledge, that's unethical. And there was a lot of that. And so, so we can talk about whether the ends of the science are good. We can talk about whether the experiments themselves are likely to lead to generalizable knowledge. And both of those things are things that are very much on the table even today. But when I was saying that eugenics was bad science, what I was saying is that the notions of heritability and about how you would sort of promote good breeding and get rid of bad breeding, whatever that was understood of at that time, just turns out not to be scientifically valid. Also immoral, but that's a different issue. I think that's where you're going, so I just went there. Is that okay? Yes, sir, in the back.
Touching on the subject of morals, something I'm wondering is if, let's say, the science on which eugenics is based was good science, and let's say that there could be made a strong scientific case that there do exist bad genes that can be controlled within society, would that change the question of whether eugenics was ethically justified or not? Is science really related to ethics?
Well, thank you. The question is, even if the science was right, would it still, would that answer the question? Well, my general view is that science never answers the question. Science just frames the question. And so to go to your hypothetical example, I mean, suppose we could say that there was a certain gene that was present in an individual, and we knew that that person was going to be bad, was going to be criminal no matter what, and that all of his or her kids, if they got the gene, would also be bad no matter what. Would we say that it is okay to sterilize that person? What I would say in the United States now, I think as a result of history, is that we would say no. That I think that that even though Buck versus Bell hasn't been overturned, there would be such a political outcry that it would be utterly unacceptable. So let me give you an example that shows how unacceptable that would be. There was a case a number of years ago where a couple out in Los Angeles had a child with cystic fibrosis. This is the most common recessive disorders among Caucasians. It causes lung disease and other things like that. And they had a child with CF. They got pregnant a second time. They got their health insurer to pay for them to have prenatal diagnosis. And they found out that the second child was also affected. And the insurance company said, and the couple said, well, you know, I mean, we're glad we know this, but we don't want to terminate this pregnancy. And the insurance company said, well, we're not going to pay for the health care of this child if you don't terminate the pregnancy. Well, that story got in the LA Times, and that was that. I mean, it was such a hue and cry that the company had to immediately back down. So I think that we're really, I mean, we have such an emphasis on autonomy, individual freedom, et cetera, in our country, and we are so worried about eugenics that that I think that it's not so much a moral issue as it is a political issue. I think it's just a non-starter. I mean, that's what we're seeing, and so, which I confess suits me fine, but I think that that's an area where the shadow of eugenics has been absolutely enormous. Absolutely enormous. So that's how I would answer that at present. Yes, sir. The question was it hue and cry over genetics or abortion? Both. It turns out, I mean, abortion clearly was part of the issue, but the real notion that people, well, actually, I'm going to give you an example that picks up on your comment. There has been a long-standing debate about whether deaf people who have genetically based deafness can choose to have deaf kids and not to have hearing kids. And in general, because of our I think because of eugenic concerns, because of notions of non-directiveness that are so prevalent in the areas of reproductive testing, that in general the answer is, yeah, we say, okay. Now, you know, I mean, the whole idea about whether we ought to be cochlear implants, various other issues with regard to people who are hearing impaired is an enormous issue. But the answer, but people struggle to say, you know, people will come up with a suggestion like that, and people will go, I can't say that they can't do that. Or when you think about people who are dwarfs, achondroplastic, Jay and I just watched a movie that had the station agent who has a achondroplastic person in it. You know, when couples who are achondroplastic have children, they have a 1/2 chance of having a child with achondroplasia. They have 1 chance out of 4 of having a child with normal height, and they have 1 chance of having a child 1 chance out of 4 of having a child who is going to have a lethal disorder. Having both achondroplasia genes is not consistent with life. And, you know, one of the issues is, you know, do they want to have a child who's like them? Another one is carrying a child, a normal-heighted child, if you're achondroplastic, is a problem. You know, so people are making choices that are that at least as understood under, you know, the policies of the early 20th century are seen as anti-eugenic. They make those choices. Yeah, David.
The birth weight of an average achondroplastic dwarf.
You asked me what the average birth weight is, and I confess I don't know.
Well, only, you know, because you're saying that a dwarf would have a difficult time carrying to, you know, partition a normal baby, which would be 7, 8 pounds.
Yeah, I think it's smaller than that. So.
It would have to be smaller.
Yeah.
Could they survive and do that? I mean, is there reports of that happening?
I don't know. Any other? Oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, sir.
Speaking of the shadow of eugenics, is there any concept of identifying the
So your question is, has there been any work to understand the impact of all the sterilizations? There are some wonderful books about this. Daniel Kevlis's book, who is a historian, has been all over the place, but he's currently at Yale, wrote a book. Troy Duster has written a book. There's another book called The Black Stork. This new work that's coming out of California is really kind of amazing. Stephen Jay Gould talks about the sister of Carrie Buck, who also had a sterilization procedure and didn't find out until she was really quite a bit older that it had been done. I mean, the answer is there's some wonderful, wonderful scholarship that I would suggest that you look at if this is an area that you're interested in. The only thing I would say is it just makes you sad. But there's some wonderful scholarship.
Is he alive? He just died. Stephen Gould.
Yes, he did die. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk. The most eugenic baby photographs are fascinating. And it makes me wonder, I know you mentioned the Calicax and the Jukes as well. It makes me think about the Calicac family and how the photographs that are included in that work are doctored to take dysgenic defects that are not visible and try and make them visible. And I'm wondering if either other examples within the American tradition or the German tradition, if that's that practice of doctoring photographs is something that you find to be common.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I mean, have you looked at the Cold Spring Harbor Archive? Well, you need to look. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of pictures. I mean, it's really quite amazing. And it is clear that Davenport fudged some of his results.
Look at any high school annual, you want doctor pictures.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you all. This has been fun.